One of the key terms we need to understand in the concept of evolution is survival of the fittest. When it comes to survival of the fittest, the question that is asked is, did you die before you were able to reproduce? Did you die before you were able to reproduce? If you did die before you were able to reproduce, you are not considered fit in the eyes of evolution because you are not able to pass down your genetic information to the next generation. If you did not die, but you instead lived long enough to reproduce, you're considered fit. The more offsprings that you have that can have offsprings of their own means you're more fit compared to someone who did not have many children or any children at all. So again, survival of the fittest is basically he who lives the longest and has the most kids pass on his genetic code to the next generation. And again, the more kids he has or she has, the fitter that person is in the concept of evolution. Today we're going to be talking about genetic drift. Genetic drift is defined as change in the frequency of different genotypes from one generation to the next. So the genetic code that you see in one generation does change from one generation to the next. And over several generations, you start to see a distinct difference from the original ancestor to the modern day organism. Genetic drift causes the extinction of certain genetic traits within a population. So genetic drift actually decreases diversity within a population, but at the same time, it increases the likelihood or the chance of speciation occurring. Speciation is where one species breaks off into two separate or different species over time. An example would be the original Canis. Canis are what dogs and wolves are classified as. The original Canis group at one point in time was the same species, but something happened in nature where they were separated into separate groups. Those separate groups then evolved into the wolves and the dogs. Genetic drift took place once the original Canis group was separated. Genetic drift caused the different groups to pass down different traits. The different traits then, in time, led to speciation. So in today's lab, we are going to simulate genetic drift. The scenario: below are generations of worms waiting to be colored in and pass on their alleles to the next generation. Remember, alleles are different forms of the same gene. For example, eye color. There's an allele for brown eyes, an allele for blue eyes, an allele for green eyes. Below are generations of worms waiting to be colored in and pass on their alleles to the next generation. Only the lucky worms survive to reproduce in the next generation. So in this simulation, our alleles will be for the different colored worms that we will have in generation 0, the original generation. So the first thing we're going to do is color in each worm in generation 0 a different color. So generation 1 has a full scale of diversity within the species. We have 6 different alleles which code for 6 different colors that the worms can have. Now the question with survival of the fittest and genetic drift is which of those genetic traits will be passed on to the next generation. So the thing about evolution is that it's random. So we're going to use a die to determine which of the worms in generation 0 will survive long enough to be able to reproduce and pass on the allele for its color onto the next generation. So we're going to roll the die and put a dot next to the corresponding worm. So it lands on 5. We're going to go ahead and put a dot on worm 5. That worm lived long enough to reproduce at least once. We're going to put a dot on worm 1. That worm lived long enough to reproduce at least one time. We're going to put a dot on worm 6. That worm lived long enough to reproduce at least once. We're going to put another dot on worm 5. That worm lived long enough to reproduce at least 2 times. We're going to put another dot on worm 6. That worm lived long enough to reproduce at least 2 times. we're going to put another dot on worm 1. That worm lived long enough to reproduce at least 2 times. So we're only going to repeat step 2 until we've chosen 6 different worms. So we rolled the dice 6 times, and that determined which of the worms lived long enough to pass on its alleles, and which worms unfortunately died. Perhaps they were hunted and killed and eaten, or perhaps they got injured, perhaps they got sick and died. Something happened where they did not live long enough to reproduce. Now we are going to color the 6 chosen worms in the next generation. So worm 1 lived long enough to reproduce 2 times. So in the next generation, 1, we're going to color in 2 of the worms green because its parent from generation 0 reproduced 2 times and had 2 offsprings. The yellow worm, unfortunately, died before it was able to reproduce. That allele is now lost and will not be passed down. Worm number 3, unfortunately, died before it was able to reproduce. Therefore, the blue allele for the worm's color will not be passed on to the next generation. Worm 4, unfortunately, died before it was able to reproduce. Therefore, the allele for the black color will not be passed down to the next generation. The brown worm was lucky enough to live long enough to reproduce twice, so it will have 2 offsprings in the next generation. The orange worm lived long enough to reproduce twice, so it will also have 2 offsprings in the second generation. We're going to repeat steps 2 through 4 until we've reached generation 4 and all the worms are colored. So at this point, generation 0 has gotten old and died. Now generation 1 is old enough to reproduce. In generation 1, the only alleles that we have present is the allele for green color, brown color, and orange color. But not all of these worms might survive long enough to reproduce. And again, because evolution happens randomly, we will roll the die to see which of the worms survive long enough. So now we're going to color in the next generation, generation 2. Worm number 1 did not live long enough to reproduce. It will not pass down its alleles to the next generation. However, worm number 2 has the same allele for green color. So that allele will still be present in generation 2, although worm number 1 died. Worm number 2 had 2 offsprings, so in generation 2 there will be 2 worms with the allele for green color. Worm number 3 lived long enough to reproduce twice. So it will have 2 offsprings with the same allele in generation 2. Worm number 4 lived long enough to reproduce at least once, so it will have 1 offspring with that same color. Worm number 5 unfortunately died before it was able to reproduce. However, worm number 6 has the same allele, so you will still see the allele for orange in generation 2. Worm number 6 lived long enough to have 1 offspring. So now, generation 1 is old and dies off. Generation 2 becomes of age where they're now able to reproduce and have their own offsprings. But again, since evolution happens randomly, we will roll the die to see which of these worms survive long enough. So in generation 2, worm number 1 lived long enough to reproduce once, so it will have 1 offspring in generation 3. Worm number 2, however, died and was not able to have any offsprings of its own. Worm number 3 also died and was not able to have any offsprings of its own. Worm number 4 lived long enough to have 3 offsprings, passing down its allele for the brown color 3 times. Unfortunately died before it was able to reproduce. Worm number 6 survived long enough to reproduce twice, therefore it will have 2 offsprings with the same allele for orange. Now generation 2 has died off, generation 3 is now old enough to survive and reproduce. So in our final generation of offsprings, worm number 1 survived long enough to have 2 offsprings with the green allele. Worm number 2 unfortunately died before it was able to reproduce. Worm number 3 survived long enough to reproduce once and was able to pass on that allele to the last generation. Worm number 4 unfortunately died before it was able to reproduce. Worm number 5 unfortunately died before it was able to reproduce. Worm number 6 was able to have 3 offsprings and pass down the allele for the orange color to that final generation. So in our final generations, the alleles that we have still present are green, brown, and orange. When we compare this last generation with the original generation, we see that diversity within the species has decreased. In generation 0, the original generation, we had 6 different alleles for 6 different colors. In our final generation, we had 3 different alleles for 3 different colors. Again, genetic drift in evolution does occur randomly. So this is just one example of one scenario and one possibility. But because nature is very random as far as which genetic traits is passed down from one generation to the next, your scenario and your group of worms might have different results.